Karoline Leavitt has never been a person who was afraid to act. Her drive for success, ambition, and political rhetoric made her a noticeable figure, especially among young people who were oriented towards conservative views. Leavitt had a strong opinion and was not shy about expressing it, especially when it came to the current political situation in the country. But everything changed when she decided it was time to stand up to one of the most influential media programs, The View. The show, which was seen as a symbol of liberal values, was known for its sharp political debates and the trenchant commentary of hosts like Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar. Leavitt, young and self-righteous, championed the need for truth and objectivity in the political sphere. She was not shy about criticizing the liberal media and its approach to covering important events. From the beginning, her position on The View was clear: the show was biased and did not adequately cover the views of people on the right. In her eyes, it was becoming part of the problem of the country's political divisions. It all started with one appearance on the show, when Leavitt was invited to participate in a discussion about the country's political situation. Unlike other guests, she quickly realized that the hosts weren't going to have an honest conversation with her. Instead of giving her space to express her views, they began asking her provocative questions that effectively undermined her arguments. Expecting a respectful conversation, Leavitt found herself trapped in bias and open attacks. It all seemed like a preset pattern that she couldn't help but respond to. After the show ended, she realized that this manipulation of opinion was no accident. Her words had been taken out of context, and the hosts had no intention of giving her the opportunity to properly answer difficult questions. Leavitt was outraged, and her determination to act only grew stronger. She knew that to change the situation, she needed to do more than just appear on air. She needed to fight the system that allows the media to dictate how people's opinions are perceived. Inspired by the flamboyant comments on her Twitter, Leavitt decided to file a lawsuit against The View. She claimed that the show violated her rights, portrayed her in a negative light, and distorted her statements in a biased way. The move was motivated not only by a desire to defend her rights, but also by a desire to draw attention to deeper problems in American media. At first, the idea seemed strange to many. After all, The View is not just a show, it is part of the cultural and political landscape of the country. Some thought that she was not ready to stand up to such a powerful machine. However, Karoline was determined, and her lawsuit soon became one of the most discussed topics. Her lawsuit was gaining more and more attention with each passing day. Liberal media outlets tried to discredit her, claiming that she was simply trying to use lawsuits as a way to gain popularity. But Karoline did not give up. She appeared in interviews more and more often, did not hesitate to express her point of view and talk about the importance of objectivity in the media. Her words resonated with many people who felt that their opinions did not have a place on shows like The View. But Leavitt's standoff with the TV hosts was just beginning to unfold. Each day brought new details and twists, and the trial itself was becoming not just a trial, but a real cultural battle in which both sides tried to impose their vision of the truth. What began as a backlash against provocative questions quickly escalated into a public war in which Karoline Leavitt showed no signs of backing down. She was suing, but that was just the beginning. The View, with its influential hosts like Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar, had long been a symbol of the American liberal elite. But for Leavitt, it wasn't just a show, it was a stage for a fight where her voice and her position were undermined. When Leavitt's lawsuit became public knowledge, the media world was divided. Leavitt's supporters saw her actions as a bold stand against a media establishment that they believed was manipulating public opinion. To them, her lawsuit became a symbol of the fight for free speech and the ability to be heard. But to her opponents, including many journalists, Leavitt's lawsuit seemed like nothing more than an attempt to inflate her political capital and suppress a free press. In their eyes, her lawsuit was an act of aggression aimed at discrediting the hosts of The View, who were simply doing their jobs. The publication of her lawsuit sparked a storm of criticism and support from liberal media. Mainstream television networks began spinning the story as if Leavitt was simply trying to attack those who did not share her political views. The social media conversations became relentless, with hundreds of comments, memes, and posts supporting both Leavitt and The View hosts. The rhetoric was fierce, and neither side was willing to back down. Meanwhile, behind the scenes at The View, panic was setting in. Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar were publicly declaring that Leavitt's lawsuit was an attack on their freedom of speech and democracy. They made no secret of their outrage. In one interview, Behar said, "This is a dangerous trend. Who's next? If we remain silent, if we are afraid to say what we think, then soon no liberal idea will be heard." While they were making their voices heard, important discussions were taking place behind the scenes at The View. The network's producers and lawyers were beginning to realize that the situation was spiraling out of control. Preparing for a trial was a huge undertaking, and ABC News was facing serious legal risks. While the hosts remained firm in their positions, their lawyers were more focused on finding ways to settle the dispute with minimal damage. Of course, Karoline Leavitt herself was not about to back down. She took the opportunity to assert her right to be heard. In one interview, she said, "I am not afraid to fight for the truth. And if someone on this show wants to continue to manipulate facts and entire layers of people, I will fight. I will not allow myself to be silenced, to have my beliefs suppressed by those who put their political agenda above all else." Leavitt became a hero to many on the right, who saw her as a voice for fairness and transparency. Media outlets on both sides of the political spectrum began using her lawsuit as a jumping-off point for discussions of broader issues around free speech, media manipulation, and politics in general. In response to continued attacks from The View, Leavitt hardened her position. She began to actively engage in media, giving interviews in which she spoke about the importance of fair and objective media. This further fueled the controversy and escalated the conflict. A major milestone came when she appeared on a political program, where she said that any attempt to suppress her opinions in the media was a threat to the country's democratic principles. Meanwhile, tensions within The View continued to mount. With the battle pitting not just journalists but public figures as well, the conflict began to spill out beyond the show. In the coming weeks, it could have a profound impact on public perception of the network and its hosts. The conflict between Karoline Leavitt and The View continued to escalate, turning into a public battle. Media platforms on both sides of the political spectrum began to actively cover the lawsuit, turning it into a symbol of broader issues around free speech, political polarization, and the manipulation of public opinion. As Leavitt battled the hosts, her image became increasingly visible on screen and on social media. Meanwhile, The View tried to justify its actions, but the public pressure and criticism from its supporters mounted. The show's hosts, most notably Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar, began making frequent on-air statements accusing Leavitt of trying to damage their reputations and stifle free speech. But the more vocal their public statements became, the more attention Leavitt attracted. Her declaration that she was not afraid to fight for the truth and would continue to fight the liberal media establishment attracted even more supporters among conservative viewers. Leavitt used every opportunity to spread her message. She continued to give interviews, tweet, and raise important issues on political shows, where she emphasized the importance of fighting manipulation by large media organizations. Leavitt openly stated that confronting The View was not just a matter of honor, but a necessary step to protect the principles of democracy and free speech. Each step attracted attention and became another step in the fight against a system that, in her opinion, did not provide equal opportunities for expression. Meanwhile, the pressure on the network and its hosts continued to mount. The View found itself at the center of a heated public backlash. Despite the hosts' confidence in their case, it was clear that the trial and further litigation could affect the network's reputation and the future of the show. Although they continued to insist on their position, internal meetings showed that the network was preparing for a possible settlement. Damage control options were discussed, and some producers expressed doubt about continuing to attack Leavitt. The conflict reached a new level when Leavitt began publishing specific examples of the falsifications and distortions she saw as part of The View's operations. These examples became the basis for her arguments in the lawsuit, and audiences no longer saw her simply as a political activist, but as someone fighting for fairness in the media. Leavitt cited other instances in which show hosts used their power and platform to manipulate public opinion and advance biased views, while excluding those who disagreed with their ideology. The situation grew more tense with each passing day. Despite the View's attempts to ignore the allegations and continue its work, pressure from the public, media, and advertisers became noticeable. Advertisers, initially confident in their partnership with the network, began to express concerns about the increased attention to the lawsuit, which could affect their image. Soon, several major brands began to suspend their contracts with The View, fearing that continuing the conflict would further damage their reputation with the audience. Leavitt, meanwhile, continued to strengthen her position. She knew that her lawsuit had already attracted attention at the highest levels, and that no matter how the trial ended, she had already won her battle for public attention. She was seen as someone who was not afraid to stand up for her views and fight against those she believed were abusing their position. Her name became synonymous with courage and determination, and her supporters saw her as a symbol of the fight for justice in the media. While the View hosts tried to minimize the damage by discussing the situation on their shows, Leavitt was preparing for her next step. Her interviews increasingly focused on the importance of fighting for free speech and objectivity in the media. She emphasized that her lawsuit was not aimed at freedom of the press, but at those who used their positions for manipulation and bias. Leavitt was confident that her fight was not just for herself, but for all those who feel the pressure of media expansion and political bias. As time went on, the public backlash against Karoline Leavitt and The View grew more intense. Leavitt was more than just a political activist. She became a symbol for many who felt their voices were being ignored in the dominant liberal media. Her words resonated with a broad audience who, like her, believed that news and talk shows should be unbiased and objective, not merely a tool to advance one ideology. At the same time, The View found itself in the midst of a furious debate as it struggled to cope with the fallout from the lawsuit. At first, hosts including Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar ignored the allegations and continued to criticize Leavitt. They claimed that her actions were an attack on their freedom of speech, on their right to be a voice for democracy. They argued that by speaking out against their show, Leavitt was attacking the very foundations of a free press, and that her lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to retaliate for political disagreements. Goldberg even said on one broadcast that Leavitt was trying to destroy the reputation of a show that has always been a place for honest debate. But behind the scenes at The View, the situation was far more tense. The show's producers, who had initially been confident in their right to suppress criticism, began to realize that the consequences of a lawsuit could be far more serious. The reputation of the show, which had long enjoyed high ratings and was part of a liberal media platform, was at risk. A lawsuit and libel charges could not only lead to financial losses, but also undermine the trust of viewers. Many of The View staffers began to express doubts. Some believed that they should compromise and apologize to Leavitt to avoid further litigation that could drag on for months or even years. Others, on the contrary, stood firm in their position, arguing that they could not give in, otherwise the show would lose its power and independence. Discussions within the staff continued, and tensions grew with each passing day. Leavitt used the moment to strengthen her position. She continued to speak publicly, give interviews, and comment on what was happening. She did not back down, emphasizing that her actions were not directed against the freedom of the press, but against the manipulation that was part of the show's work. In one interview, she said that her lawsuit was an attempt to remind everyone that the media should serve society, and not use its power to promote one ideology. Her words often sounded in the context of the fight for objectivity and honesty, which attracted more and more supporters. But with each tweet and speech Leavitt gave, her detractors grew more aggressive. Talk show hosts and bloggers who espoused liberal views began accusing her of overstepping boundaries and manipulating public opinion. Liberal journalists claimed that Leavitt was deliberately using the lawsuits to attack their political views, and that her campaign against The View was part of a broader battle for political expediency in the media. They began to argue that Leavitt, like many conservative activists, had no interest in truth or objectivity. Her primary goal was to destroy the liberal media's influence on public opinion. Meanwhile, the situation on social media was becoming increasingly heated. Leavitt's supporters were actively supporting her actions, organizing online petitions demanding justice and arguing that conservative voices in the media were indeed being infringed. Liberal users, in turn, began to attack her, calling her hypocritical and bigoted. The standoff continued, and tensions only grew. Leavitt continued her activism, emphasizing in every interview and tweet that her fight was not for personal gain, but for the truth, for freedom of speech that would be equal for everyone. But amid all the hype, signs began to emerge that the conflict was not just political. Advertisers got involved. Well-known brands began to refuse to cooperate with The View, fearing that further support for a show that was at the center of a scandal could negatively affect the image of their products. Long-term contracts with the network were suspended, and advertising agencies began to look for other options for cooperation. This situation was a real blow to a show that was accustomed to stable income and high ratings. The View was caught in the middle of a maelstrom, and now only time would tell where the conflict would lead. Leavitt continued to fight, becoming a symbol for those willing to stand up to the big media machine, and The View tried to find a way to smooth over the fallout and save its reputation. Shortly after Leavitt filed her second lawsuit, things reached a fever pitch. Public attention was so focused on the trial that it overshadowed other major events in the country. The View was no longer the serene media platform it once was. The show's hosts, despite their public statements that they would not back down, began to feel pressure not only from the public but also from within the network itself. Every morning there was a discussion in the newsroom, where the staff and producers seemed to be doing everything to soften the blow. This was not just a legal battle, it was a real battle for the future of the show and its reputation. Viewers were beginning to split into two camps, and neither side was ready to give ground. This whole war was now being waged not only in the courts, but on screens, on the internet, and in the streets. One after another, the View hosts made statements again and again, trying to justify their behavior. Whoopi Goldberg said in an interview that Leavitt wants to destroy free speech and democracy. The phrase went viral, and even her fans began to ask questions. Many people wondered what was behind this statement. When Leavitt, in response to another attack, made a statement that her lawsuit was not an attack on free speech, but a demand for justice, she again attracted attention with her determination. She said that her actions were not just a personal conflict, but a fight for freedom of opinion in the country, for the absence of bias, manipulation, and for respect for everyone. Amid all this, gossip began to swirl around The View. The network found itself at the center of a media storm, and advertisers began to leave in droves. The first companies to suspend their partnerships were major brands that had long had contracts with the show. This caused real panic among producers, who began to realize that in a crisis, they either had to compromise or prepare for a full-scale loss of reputation. All this happened against the backdrop of Leavitt's continued rise in popularity among her supporters. Meanwhile, her campaign was attracting more and more people who had previously been uninterested in her political views. Leavitt became a symbol of the fight for fair media, and her determination was respected. While The View and its hosts continued to fight public pressure, she calmly continued to do her job, without being distracted from the main goal, justice and freeing the media space from political manipulation. But the internal pressure on The View continued to mount. Even the show's most ardent fans began to have doubts. Liberal media outlets began to ask whether the stakes for a free press and openness were too high if they had to continue to fight Leavitt to protect their reputation. Even if they won in court, their victory would have long-term consequences for the network and its image. This left the network's management with a difficult choice: continue to ignore the criticism or find a way to right the ship. Many of Leavitt's supporters began to argue that The View was just the tip of the iceberg. They believed that her fight wasn't just against one show, but against a system that had for too long allowed media giants to shape political and social issues as they saw fit. To them, every tweet, every public statement from Leavitt was an important step toward restoring balance and fairness to the country's media landscape. Ultimately, The View couldn't escape the consequences. Despite the show's attempts to defend itself, Leavitt's lawsuit had a far greater impact on them than expected. It wasn't just a legal victory for Leavitt, but a landmark moment for anyone who felt slighted or ignored in the media landscape. The View, as it turns out, was no longer the influential voice it once was.